Gustav III was King of Sweden from 1771 until his assassination in 1792. He was the eldest son of King Adolf, Frederick of Sweden, and Queen Louise, Ulrika, a sister of King Frederick the Great of Prussia, and a first cousin of Empress Catherine the Great of Russia by reason of the common descent from Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp, Prince of Eutin, and his wife Albertina Frederica of Baden-Durlach. Gustav was a vocal opponent of what he saw as the abuse of political privileges that had been negotiated from the crown on behalf of the nobility. Since the death of King Charles XII, he seized power from the government in a coup d'etat in 1772 that ended the Age of Liberty in Sweden and initiated a campaign to restore autocracy. This process was completed by the Union and Security Act of 1789, which swept away most of the political powers once exercised by the Swedish Parliament. As a bulwark of enlightened despotism, he spent considerable public funds on cultural ventures, a controversial policy among his critics. His later reign was marred by attempts to seize Norway with Russian assistance, and then by unsuccessful attempts to recapture Baltic provinces lost during the Great Northern War of the early 18th century by means of a war against Russia, the Russo Swedish War. Nonetheless, much of Sweden's former military might was restored. An admirer of Voltaire, Gustav legalized Catholic and Jewish presence in the realm and enacted wide-ranging reforms aimed at economic liberalism, social reform and the restriction of torture and capital punishment. The much-praised Freedom of the Press Act of 1766 was severely curtailed, however, by amendments in 1774 and 1792 that effectively extinguished all independent media. Following the French Revolution of 1789, Gustav pursued an alliance of monarchs aimed at crushing the insurrection and reinstating his French counterpart, King Louis XVI, by offering Swedish assistance to the royal cause in France under his leadership. He was mortally wounded by a gunshot in the lower back during a masquerade ball as part of an aristocratic parliamentary coup attempt, but managed to assume command and quell the uprising before succumbing to septicemia 13 days later, a period during which he received apologies from many of his political enemies. Gustav's immense powers were placed in the hands of a regency under his brother Prince Karl until his son and successor Gustav IV Adolf reached adulthood in 1796. The Gustavian autocracy hence survived until 1809, when his son abdicated the Swedish throne. A patron of the arts and benefactor of arts and literature, Gustav founded the Swedish Academy, created a national costume and had the Royal Swedish Opera built. In 1772 he founded the Royal Order of Vasa to acknowledge and reward those Swedes who had contributed to advances in the fields of agriculture, mining and commerce. In 1782, Gustav III was the first neutral head of state in the world to recognize the United States during its war for independence from Great Britain. Royal title: Gustav III was known in Sweden and abroad by his royal titles or styles: Gustav, by the grace of God, of the Swedes, the Goths and the Wends King, Grand Prince of Finland, Duke of Pomerania, Prince of Rügen and Lord of Wismar, heir to Norway and Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, Stormarn and Dithmarschen, Count of Oldenburg and Delmenhorst, etc., etc. Education: Gustav was born in Stockholm. He was placed under the tutelage of Hedvig Elisabeth Stromfelt until the age of 5, then educated under the care of two governors who were among the most eminent Swedish statesmen of the day, Carl Gustaf Tesson and Carl Fredrik Schäfer. Nonetheless, he perhaps owed most of what shaped him during his early education to the poet and historian Olaf von Dalen. State interference with his education as a young child caused significant political disruptions within the royal family. Gustav's parents taught him to despise the governors imposed upon him by the Riksdag, and the atmosphere of intrigue and duplicity in which he grew up made him precociously experienced in the art of dissimulation. Even his most hostile teachers were amazed by his combination of natural gifts. Moreover, he possessed already as a boy the charm of manner that was to make him so fascinating and so dangerous in later life, coupled with a strong dramatic instinct that won him an honorable place in Swedish literature. On the whole, Gustav cannot be said to have been well educated, but he read widely. There was scarcely a French author of his day with whose works he was not intimately acquainted. His enthusiasm for the ideas of the French Enlightenment was as sincere as that of his mother, if more critical. Marriage and sons. Gustav married Princess Sophia Magdalena, daughter of King Frederick V of Denmark, by proxy in Christiansborg Palace, Copenhagen, on 1 October 1766 and in person in Stockholm on 4 November 1766. The match was not a happy one, owing partly to an incompatibility of temperament, but still more to the interference of Gustav's jealous mother, Queen Louise Ulrika. The marriage produced two children, Crown Prince Gustav Adolf and Prince Carl Gustav, Duke of Småland. For the consummation of the marriage, the king and queen requested actual physical instruction by Count Adolf Munk, reportedly because of anatomical problems of both spouses. Gustav's mother supported rumors that he was not the father of his first son and heir. It was rumored at the time that Gustav was homosexual. The close personal relationships which he formed with two of his courtiers, Count Axel von Fersen and Baron Gustav Armfelt, were alluded to in that regard. His sister-in-law Charlotte implied as much in her famous diary. Professor Erik Lönnroth of the Swedish Academy, who has described the assistance provided by Munk, has concluded that there is no factual basis for the assumption that Gustav III was homosexual. When his second son was born, there was no doubt in anyone as to his legitimacy, and the boy was strong and healthy. King Gustav was especially fond of him and suffered obvious and severe mental and physical reactions to the baby's illness and death. The spring of 1783 has been considered a turning point in the king's personality. After his controversial mother's death in 1782, he found consolation in the birth of the Duke of Småland, but this was followed by severe grief when the child died the following year. Politics of an heir apparent. Gustav first intervened actively in politics in 1768, when he compelled the Dommerkapp faction, which mainly represented the interests of the peasantry and clergy, to summon an extraordinary diet from which he hoped for the reform of the constitution in a way that would increase the power of the crown. But the victorious Hat Party, which mainly represented the interests of the aristocracy and military establishment, refused to redeem the pledges that they had given before the previous elections. That we should have lost the constitutional battle does not distress us so much, wrote Gustav, in the bitterness of his heart, but what does dismay me is to see my poor nation so sunk in corruption as to place its own felicity in absolute anarchy. Gustav found greater success abroad. For the 4th of February to the 25th of March 1771, Gustav was in Paris, where he carried both the court and the city by storm. The poets and the philosophers paid him enthusiastic homage, and distinguished women testified to his superlative merits. With many of them he maintained a lifelong correspondence. His visit to the French capital was, however, no no mere pleasure trip, it was also a political mission. Confidential agents from the Swedish court had already prepared the way for him, and the Duke of Choiseul, the retired chief minister, resolved to discuss with him the best method of bringing about a revolution in France's ally, Sweden. Before he departed, the French government undertook to pay the outstanding subsidies to Sweden unconditionally, at the rate of 1.5 million livres annually. Count de Vergennes, one of the most prominent French diplomats, was transferred from Constantinople to Stockholm. On his way home, Gustav paid a short visit to his uncle, Frederick the Great, at Potsdam. Frederick bluntly informed his nephew that, in concert with Russia and Denmark, he had guaranteed the integrity of the existing Swedish constitution. He advised the young monarch to play the part of mediator and abstain from violence. Coup d'etat. On his return to Sweden, Gustav III tried to mediate between the bitterly divided hat and cap parties. On the 21st of June 1771, he opened his first Riksdag with a speech that aroused powerful emotions. It was the first time in more than a century that a Swedish king had addressed a Swedish Riksdag in its native tongue. He stressed the need for all parties to sacrifice their animosities for the common good, and volunteered, as the first citizen of a free people, to be the mediator between the contending factions. A composition committee was actually formed, but it proved illusory from the first. The patriotism of neither faction was sufficient for the smallest act of self-denial. The subsequent attempts of the dominant caps to reduce him to a war fainéant encouraged him to consider a coup d'etat. Under the sway of the cap faction, Sweden seemed in danger of falling prey to the political ambitions of Russia. It appeared on the point of being absorbed into the Northern Accord sought by the Russian Vice-Chancellor, Count Nikita Panin. It seemed to many that only a swift and sudden coup d'etat could preserve Sweden's independence. At this juncture, Gustav III was approached by Jacob Magnus Sprengtporten, a Finnish nobleman who had incurred the enmity of the caps. With the prospect of a revolution, he undertook to seize the fortress of Sveaborg in Finland by coup de main. Once Finland was secured, he intended to embark for Sweden, join up with the king and his friends near Stockholm, and force the estates to accept a new constitution dictated by the king. At this juncture, the plotters were reinforced by Johann Christopher Toll, another victim of cap oppression. Toll proposed to raise a second revolt in the province of Scania, and to secure the southern fortress of Kristianstad. After some debate, it was agreed that Kristianstad should openly declare against the government a few days after the Finnish revolt had begun. Duke Charles, the eldest of the king's brothers, would thereupon be forced to mobilize the garrisons of all the southern fortresses hastily, ostensibly to crush the revolt at Kristianstad, but on arriving in front of the fortress, he was to make common cause with the rebels and march upon the capital from the south, while Sprengtporten attacked it simultaneously from the east. The entire revolutionary enterprise was underwritten with loans procured from the French financier Nicolas Beaujean, arranged by the Swedish ambassador to France, Count Kreutz. On the 6th of August 1772, Toll succeeded in winning the fortress of Kristianstad by sheer bluff, and on the 16th of August, Sprengtporten succeeded in surprising Sveaborg, but contrary winds prevented him from crossing to Stockholm. Events soon occurred that made his presence unnecessary in any case. On the 16th of August, the cap leader, Ture Rydbeck, arrived at Stockholm with news of the insurrection in the south, and Gustav found himself isolated in the midst of enemies. Sprengtporten lay weather-bound in Finland. Toll was 500 miles away. The hat leaders were in hiding. Gustav thereupon resolved to strike the decisive blow without waiting for Sprengtporten's arrival. He acted promptly. On the evening of the 18th of August, all the officers whom he thought he could trust received secret instructions to assemble in the great square facing the arsenal on the following morning. At 10 o'clock on the 19th of August, Gustav mounted his horse and rode to the arsenal. On the way, his adherents joined him in little groups, as if by accident, so that by the time he reached his destination he had about 200 officers in his suite. After parade he reconducted them to the guardroom in the northwestern wing of the palace where the Guard of Honor had its headquarters, and unfolded his plans to them. He told the assembled officers, "If you follow me, just like your ancestors followed Gustav Vasa and Gustavus Adolphus, then I will risk my life and blood for you and the salvation of the fatherland." A young ensign then spoke up, "We are willing to sacrifice both blood and life in your Majesty's service." Gustav then dictated a new oath of allegiance, and everyone signed it without hesitation. It absolved them from their allegiance to the estates, and bound them solely to obey the lawful king, Gustav III. Meanwhile, the Privy Council and its president, Rudbeck, had been arrested and the fleet secured. Then Gustav made a tour of the city and was everywhere received by enthusiastic crowds, who hailed him as a deliverer. A song was composed by Carl Michael Bellman called the Toast to King Gustav. On the evening of the 20th of August, heralds roamed the streets proclaiming that the estates were to meet at the palace on the following day. Every deputy absenting himself would be regarded as the enemy of his country and his king. On the 21st of August, the king appeared in full regalia. Taking his seat on the throne, he delivered his famous Philippic, viewed as one of the masterpieces of Swedish oratory, in which he reproached the estates for their unpatriotic venality and license in the past. Part of the speech by Gustav III to the estates, has given birth to hatred, hatred to revenge, revenge to persecution, persecution to new revolutions which finally have passed into a period of disease, which has wounded and degraded the whole nation. Ambition and lust for glory on the part of a few people have damaged the realm, and blood has been shed by both parties, and the result of this has been the suffering of the people. The establishment of their own power base has been the sole goal of those ruling, often at the cost of other citizens, and always at the cost of the nation. In times when the law was clear, the law was distorted, and when that was not possible, it was broken. Nothing has been sacred to a populace bent on hatred and revenge, and lunacy has finally reached so far that it has been assumed that members of parliament are above the law, the not having any other guidance than their own consciences. By this freedom, the most noble of human rights have been transformed by an unbearable aristocratic despotism in the hands of the ruling party, which in itself has been subdued by few. A new constitution, the instrument of government, was read to the estates and unanimously accepted by them. The Diet was then dissolved. Between constitutionalism and absolutism, Gustav worked towards reform in the same direction as other contemporary sovereigns of the Age of Enlightenment. Criminal justice became more lenient, the death penalty was restricted to a relatively short list of crimes, and torture was abolished in order to gain confessions, although strict death penalty, with torture like corporal punishment preceding the execution, was maintained. He took an active part in every department of business, but relied heavily on extra-official councillors of his own choosing rather than upon the Privy Council of Sweden. The effort to remedy the widespread corruption that had flourished under the hats and cabs engaged a considerable share of his time, and he even found it necessary to put on trial the entire Göta hovrätt, the superior court of justice, in Jönköping. Measures were also taken to reform the administration and judicial procedures. In 1774, an ordinance was proclaimed providing for the liberty of the press, though within certain limits. The national defences were raised to a great power scale, and the navy was so enlarged as to become one of the most formidable in Europe. The dilapidated finances were set in good order by the Currency Realization Ordinance of 1776. Gustav also introduced new national economic policies. In 1775, free trade in grain was promoted and several oppressive export tolls were abolished. The Poor Law was amended and limited religious liberty was proclaimed for both Roman Catholics and Jews. Gustav even designed and popularized a Swedish national costume, which was in general use among the upper classes from 1778 until his death. The king's one great economic blunder was the attempt to make the sale of alcohol a government monopoly, which clearly infringed upon the privileges of the estates. Gustav's foreign policy, on the other hand, was at first both restrained and cautious. Thus, when the king summoned the estates to assemble at Stockholm on 3 September 1778, he could give a highly positive account of his 6 years' stewardship. The Riksdag was quite obsequious towards the king. There was no room for a single question during the whole session. Short as the session was, it was long enough for the deputies to realize that the political supremacy was over. They had changed places with the king. He was now indeed the sovereign lord. For all his gentleness, he guarded the royal prerogative fiercely and plainly showed that he would continue to do so. Even those who were prepared to acquiesce in the change by no means liked it. If the Riksdag of 1778 had been docile, the Riksdag of 1786 was mutinous. The consequence was that nearly all the royal propositions were either rejected outright or so modified that Gustav himself withdrew them. Earlier in foreign affairs, however, and privately, Gustav had shown considerable interest in the American Revolution and had this to say about it in October 1776. It is such an interesting drama to see in nation create itself, that I, if I now had not been who I am, would go to America to follow up close every phase in the emergence of this new republic. This perhaps is America's century. The new republic, which hardly has a population put together better than Rome had to begin with, may perhaps take advantage of Europe someday, in the same manner as Europe has taken advantage of America for 2 centuries. No matter what, I cannot help but admire the courage and enthusiastically appreciate the daring absolute monarchy. The Riksdag of 1786 marks a turning point in Gustav's history. Henceforth he showed a growing determination to rule without a parliament, a cautious and gradual passage from semi-constitutionalism to semi-absolutism. At the same time, his foreign policy became more adventurous. At first he sought to gain Russian support to acquire Norway from Denmark. When Catherine the Great refused to abandon her ally Denmark, Gustav declared war on Russia in June 1788. While it was deeply engaged in a war with the Ottoman Empire to the south, in embarking on a war of aggression without the consent of the estates, Gustav violated his own constitution of 1772, which led to a serious mutiny. The Angela conspiracy. Among his aristocratic officers in Finland, Denmark declared war in support of its Russian ally, but was soon neutralized through British and Prussian diplomacy. Returning to Sweden, Gustav aroused popular indignation against the mutinous aristocratic officers. Ultimately, he quelled their rebellion and arrested its leaders. Capitalizing on the powerful anti-aristocratic passions thus aroused, Gustav summoned a Riksdag early in 1789, at which he He put through an Act of Union and Security on 17 February 1789 with the backing of the three lower estates. This reinforced monarchical authority significantly, although the estates retained the power of the purse. In return, Gustav abolished most of the old privileges of the nobility. Russo Swedish War. Throughout 1789 and 1790, Gustav conducted a war with Russia known as the Russo Swedish War of 1788 to 1790. At first, the venture seemed headed for disaster before the Swedes successfully broke a blockade by the Russian fleet at the Battle of Svensk Sund on 9 July, 1790. This is regarded as the greatest naval victory ever achieved by the Swedish Navy. The Russians lost one-third of their fleet and 7,000 men. A month later, on 14 August 1790, a peace treaty was signed between Russia and Sweden, the Treaty of Varala. Only 18 months before, Catherine had declared that the odious and revolting aggression of the King of Sweden would be forgiven only if he testified his repentance, by agreeing to a peace granting a general and unlimited amnesty to all his rebels and consenting to a guarantee by the Swedish Riksdag for the observance of peace in the future. The Treaty of Varala spared Sweden from any such humiliating concession, and in October 1791, Gustav concluded an 8 years defensive alliance with the Empress, who thereby bound herself to pay her new ally an annual subsidy of 300,000 rubles. Gustav next aimed at forming a league of princes against the revolutionary government in France, and subordinated every other consideration to this goal. His profound knowledge of popular assemblies enabled him, alone among contemporary sovereigns, to gauge the scope of the French Revolution accurately from the first. He was hampered, however, by financial restrictions and lack of support from the other European powers. Then, after the brief Diet of Gavlar on the 22nd of January, the 24th of February 1792, he fell victim to a widespread political conspiracy among his aristocratic enemies.